As the Custos appointed by the Faculty of Humanities, I declare the beginning of this public defense of a doctoral dissertation.
A few years ago, my gaming headset broke. The headset was an important tool for me, since at the time I was a raid group leader in an online MMORPG. I needed the headset to communicate with my team members in voice chat in the game, to remind them of boss battle mechanics, and to make quick calls about how to adapt to any mistakes that were bound to happen in the heat of battle. For me, the headset was a tool that I was using every day in my gaming hobby, something that felt completely natural for me to use as an active gamer, playing certain types of games with people from around the world. So when the headset broke, I needed to urgently replace it. To do that, I went to the local electronic stores to see what they had to offer. In the store, I instantly headed towards their gaming section. As I was browsing through their headset selection, a salesperson, a man, approached me, asking if he could help me with anything. As I told the salesperson that I'm looking for a new headset, he thought I was lost and confused. "Oh, but this is the gaming section," he said. "What are you looking for is over there," he continued, pointing towards the section with general headphones away from the gaming technology. This is one of the situations in which I have personally been assumed to not be a gamer because of my gender. In this situation, the salesperson took one look at me, assumed me as a woman, and figured that therefore I must not know where I was or what I wanted to buy, despite me being very clear about my intentions. The man salesperson had decided that I wasn't a gamer, that I couldn't be. The situation I just described demonstrates the motivation driving my dissertation study. As a woman gamer and as a researcher studying women gamers, I have repeatedly come face to face with the general limits of women's game cultural capital and game cultural agency. With how women can be just as active, skilled, and enthusiastic about gaming and still not considered as much gamers as men, particularly in the hegemonic core of digital game culture, which my study focuses on. Moving away from my personal experience towards a wider perspective, in the past decade in particular, we have seen countless media stories reporting how women are being pushed away, even violently, from different areas of game culture. I would like to pause here for a moment and notify the audience that the next section of this lectio contains mentions of threats of physical violence, sexual violence, and death. And if you don't wish to hear about these topics here today, you may step outside the lecture hall for a moment. The misogynistic hate campaigns following the announcement of feminist media critic Anita Sarkeesian tropes versus women in video games in 2012 and the so-called Gamergate movement in 2014 have shown women and non-binary persons involved in gaming targeted with systematic harassment and threats of violence, death, and rape, forced to flee their homes while their home addresses were being spread online. When Sarkeesian was granted the Ambassador Award at the Game Developers Conference in 2014, the event was targeted with a bomb threat. In October 2014, Utah State University was threatened with the deadliest school shooting in the history of the United States if Sarkeesian were to be allowed to speak on the university campus. These violent threats were made with the aim to silence women's voices discussing problematic aspects of game culture. In organized competitive digital gaming, also known as electronic sports, the International Esports Federation wanted to exclude women from World Championship tournaments in 2014. The organization tried to justify their decision by claiming they were making it to promote female players and to promote esports as legitimate sports, as if it could not be a real sport if any women were involved. This decision was, however, swiftly overturned after a massive wave of negative feedback from the global esports community. Media stories have reported on the misogynistic hostility experienced by women players as well. In the sphere of esports, in 2016, a woman Overwatch player, Geguri, was suspected of cheating in the game. There were several men players who did not believe that her skills were as good as her win ratio. Two of them proclaimed that if Geguri could prove her skills to be true, they would quit their own professional careers. One player even threatened to visit her house with a knife. Geguri, who was only 17 years old at the time, was forced to participate in a live broadcast showing her gameplay to prove her doubters wrong. Importantly, it was not only her skill that was put under scrutiny, but also her appearance and her gender performance. Around a year ago, in July 2021, Activision Blizzard, which is known for games such as World of Warcraft, Overwatch, and Hearthstone, was sued by the California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing following a 2-year investigation that found that the company discriminated against their women employees. The news stories about the case described the company's frat boy culture, which included various forms of sexual harassment systemically targeted at women employees. Similar reports have been shared from many other game companies, for example Riot Games, known for League of Legends in 2018, and indie studio Moon Studios, known for Ori and the Blind Forest, in March this year. Reports on events like these demonstrate that the sexism of game culture is not limited to gaming environment, but it covers the industry and other sectors of game culture as well. Furthermore, while the presented examples are individual situations, they reflect the wider misogyny and sexism in game culture affecting all women participating in this field. I began this doctoral research project because I wished to understand the cultural structures excluding women from game culture and from the idea of a gamer. Why is it, I wondered, that everyone plays, but some are considered more gamers than others simply because of their gender? I wish to understand the gender limits of women's game cultural participation and agency. And, even more so, I wanted to legitimize women as gamers. In the field of game studies, gender wasn't the central topic of research when I began working on this study in 2014. However, during the research process, there has been a lot of important and high-quality work published on this topic. Similarly to gender studies and many other research fields, the academic understanding of the effects of gender in gaming has developed from essentialist notions of assumed gender differences towards a more varied intersectional perspectives. It is indeed important to acknowledge that individuals' opportunities for game cultural participation and agency are affected by many different factors, including her intersecting identities. However, I argue that it's still important to study women players as a marginalized player group, because there exist gender-based structures of discrimination targeted specifically against women in game culture. This is not to undermine other prevalent structures of marginalization and discrimination in game culture, such as racism and hate towards gender and sexual minorities. On the contrary, it is important to note that the discriminatory structures of game culture affect many, if not most, players in different ways depending on their background. In my doctoral dissertation, I have sought to understand how women are participating in and rejected from game culture in the context of Finnish game culture in particular. In the study, I examined Finnish women players' gaming practices, game cultural participation, and their relationship to gamer identity, aiming to understand how women's game cultural agency can be understood beyond the gamer identity. Over 750 women participated in the study. The research material consists of 20 interviews and 737 online questionnaire responses, both of which I have collected from Finnish adult women who play digital games. Both the interviews and the online questionnaire report women's current gaming practices and gaming histories, participation in gaming events, production and consumption of game media, following of and participation in esports, gamer definitions and gamer identity, how gender affects their gaming, and the meanings of gaming in the women's lives. There are several key findings that I wish to highlight here in particular. First of all, the study shows that despite gaming having become a mainstream activity and women's gaming activity matching men's in player statistics, women are still a player group marginalized because of their gender. Furthermore, even though women are playing games and otherwise engaging with game culture actively and versatilely, their gaming remains largely hidden. This is sometimes a conscious choice because women need to develop safety strategies against the gender-based harassment they face in gaming. Secondly, there exist gendered barriers to women's game cultural participation. Because of this, women's gaming is often limited to familiar company and home environment, and women are rather taking the role of consumers than producers of game culture. It is particularly challenging for women to participate in the most visible and most valued areas of game culture, such as electronic sports and streaming. What is significant here is that gender is the factor separating women from other gamers, pushing them into the margins of game culture. 3 out of 4 women participating in the study had experienced their gender affecting their gaming, mostly negatively. Women's gaming is belittled, their skills are underestimated, and they face misogyny and gender-based harassment while gaming and otherwise participating in game culture. On the other hand, some participants had experienced their gender affecting their gaming in positive ways, and some were proud to call themselves women gamers, specifically. Thirdly, supportive social environments are central to women's gaming. Women still often gain initial access to game culture through men and boys, and their continuous gaming hobby is often supported by men partners or friends. Many participants told similar stories about how they had first started playing on a gaming console that their father had bought into their childhood home, after watching their brother play, or after being encouraged by a boyfriend. Stories like these about mothers, sisters, or girlfriends were significantly rarer. This shows that men and boys are still the gatekeepers of game culture. Earlier in this lectio, I described my wish to legitimize women as gamers as my initial motivation for this study. However, what I learned during the research process is that women do not need their gaming legitimized. While I began the research process with the stand that women should be included in the idea of a gamer, it turned out that the women who participated in the study did not really care for being identified as one. While the participants seemed to be well aware of the cultural status and expectations related to gamer identity, they often chose to reject it, either through a conscious choice or simply by considering it irrelevant. Instead of being gamers, the women wanted to define their gaming and its meaning to them on their own terms, breaking free from the gendered norms of game culture and taking over their own game cultural agency. I argue that to understand players from the perspective of game culture studies, we should not only investigate gaming practices, different forms of game cultural participation, and the question of who count as gamers through the narrow lens of gamer identity, but instead by exploring the wider sphere of game cultural agency and how its opportunities and limitations manifest differently to different player groups. This is particularly important in the case of player groups such as women, whose participation in game culture, however active, often remains hidden or marginalized due to systematic exclusion, discrimination, and harassment. By critically examining the forms and limits of game cultural agency, we can achieve a deeper understanding of how people gain entrance into game culture, how they engage with games and participate in game cultural activities, and what kind of roles and meanings games hold in their lives. Importantly, we can learn more about the obstacles and obstructions limiting different aspects of people's game cultural participation. Agency cannot be fully understood by only examining the actions of an individual, but it is necessary to also examine what is missing from it and how it is affected by embodied and situated subject positions, as well as social and cultural context. Based on this study, in the case of women players, it is clear that their game cultural agency does not simply derive from their engagement with games and their culture, but also from how they are perceived and treated as women occupying this field. So that was addressed to my learned Custos, my esteemed opponent and honorable members of the audience, in case I just forgot to mention that because I was so nervous. And now I respectfully ask you, esteemed senior lecturer Emma Witkowski, as the opponent appointed by the Faculty of Humanities for the public defense of my doctoral dissertation, to present your criticism of my doctoral dissertation.
Thank you to the candidate and thank you to the Custos. As we've just heard, we're going to hear about why people play games, why it's part of their central part of their leisure lives, and why that matters. The research presented by the candidate explores an ongoing cultural encounter surrounding digital games, that is, identity construction and societal meaning making through digital play. The candidate has worked hard to extend our knowledge today on individual and community actions underpinning diverse forms of cultural participation in games, game cultural agency, as well as one's experience of belonging in leisure. This kind of qualitative knowledge on how people play matters for all of us, and just how, the candidate will further deliberate on in a moment. Throughout the mixed methods study and analysis, the candidate gives us a sense of what participation looks and feels like, using the tools of interviews, observations, and survey data. And later on, we'll be discussing how this configuration of methods and research approach leaves us well informed on this slice of game cultural participation. Women's practices and strategies for continued play are well discussed topics, with rich qualitative and ethnographic studies reaching back over decades. But the infrastructures propping up digital game participation are always on the move, and game studies' relevancy is supported by research keeping pace with those changes and techniques of inclusion and exclusion, oppression and resistance, which deeply affect social relationships and how we live and maneuver through our everyday lives with games. As we engage with games, our participation can often resonate as being co-located. In this co-located state of play, where we are simultaneously managing online and local physical presence, we can also consider how grand theory makes sense in our contemporary state of doing games and performing identity whilst both here and there. While the candidate is built on what we know about gendered practices surrounding game engagement, she highlights how ongoing participation for women, even in inhospitable leisure spaces, moves beyond gender-specific issues affecting game cultural agency. She does this from the standpoint of a high gender equality region and from folks who use digital games as a serious and very time-intensive part of their leisure. In exploring Finnish women experiences of their leisure mobility, agency and identity within game cultures, we're provided with new knowledge and perspective on the state of gendered participation in games, not just regionally, but globally. The candidate has produced a document that allows for global comparisons and local to global cultural flows from distinct fields of play, including emerging esports worlds, co-located mega events, procedures of team game involvement, and everyday domestic play alongside of other game-oriented practices. This helps us to understand the relational importance of distinct social and technical processes underlying everyday involvement with games, while considering the cultural contexts and gender performances surrounding them. The research extends us from casual to career-oriented play and opens up a conversation on the state of play for those already involved in or emerging into the sport of video games, that is esports. And I'm particularly keen to hear how this study on Finnish women who invest time, energy, and identity in regular competitive play can speak further to the paucity of women in esports, but also to the thrills and pleasures of play therein. Within this work, we're also given a way to think about how game studies scholars might productively shift their investigative standpoint to not simply retell stories of those who claim expertise. New terms are provided, namely a shift to understanding game cultural participation as a framework to consider game-oriented leisure, which does not necessarily mean having one's hands on the controller. The candidate asserts that we have moved into a post-gamer era. And today we get to hear more about what that is, why such boundary terms are necessary, and what that means for game studies, as well as for the people who spend their leisure time on, in, and around digital games. My role here today is to ask questions to help us better understand how this material has been produced and how this study matters for all of us. So let's begin and hear more from the candidate on how involvement in game cultures matters. So you have this amazing line in the dissertation, and it comes from your qualitative research. The PC is as personal as a toothbrush. And it even resonates with your opening statement here. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about ownership and how ownership and individual possession over things, but also discussions of rules, really matter for women's leisure here and that game cultural agency that you're keen to discuss.
Thank you, honored opponent. And as an announcement to the audience, we have agreed to call each other by first names from now on. Yes, ownership, for sure, that is important. And that is a line that came from one of the questionnaire respondents, describing about how gaming devices are shared with their household. She had a man partner, and she explained that, of course, we have our own devices. Like, I wouldn't share my toothbrush with him, so I surely won't share my console. And yes, that was indeed quite cool. It was very interesting to me and surprising in a positive way that, because we read from previous studies, particularly from describing the gaming of young girls, that they often do not have their personal gaming devices. Or if they do, they get the devices that their brother had used and then discarded, and then they can maybe get that if they are lucky. So it was a positive surprise to me that I think I'm not entirely sure, and I cannot check the number right now because I don't remember which page is it on, but I think it was around 60% of my participants that said that they have gaming devices in their personal use only, and this didn't count for mobile phones. So quite large number of the participants in this study had their own personal gaming devices, and indeed displayed this ownership of their own gaming and control over their own gaming, which I find is very important for game cultural agency.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I've got that noted down. It wasn't even 60%, it was 70%.
Oh, wow.
So even higher. And I'd love to stick with that. So you've got this high number of women speaking about buying their own device, 70%. But can you also expand on that investment? Because it seems like there's some kind of congruency between that time investment, but also monetary investment. Is there something in that?
That is a very interesting question, but also because the respondents didn't really explain that, or they didn't really refer to money, apart from when they were speaking about their self-built gaming PCs and how much the certain parts in those gaming PCs had cost, in which they showed great expertise, but also like it was important to me, it felt, for them to kind of showcase the power, but also the cost. And not only the monetary cost, but also the cost of labor and expertise they had put into it. Like they described, for example, organizing building parties or spending a long time waiting for certain parts to come on the market and making those decisions and so on. So in that situation, the money discussion was involved. But interestingly, even though we know that gamer identity is a consumer identity, it is based on the idea of consuming certain cultural products, which are games, and other culture around them, and spending money on that. Money was not really talked about apart from that. But except now I can already think about another exception in addition to the self-built PCs. When they said that for some their gaming had been very limited in their childhood homes, for example, and they didn't really have that control over the devices, which we just discussed. So when they moved to their own apartment and had their own money, they were able to make those decisions, decide which games, which devices to buy, and really start their gaming hobby. So in those two senses, the money was there, but it was surprisingly rarely discussed, considering how important money is for gamer identity and game cultural activities.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And everything you're saying there resonates with me from like Virginia Woolf and having a room of one's own. And it's more about the space and the closed door than actually the buying of that space. Can we stick with domestic play a bit? Because we're going to cross a number of different contexts, and domestic play is super interesting because we don't get behind the closed door except for our own spaces. You also had a bit of a conversation throughout your thesis around this consent for use of play of other people's devices or not tinkering with others' machines. So can you talk about sort of having those intimate relationships where there are really clear rules about how you can play games?
Yeah, that was not a very central theme in the thesis, but it was surely there, because the personal relationships with the devices and the control over them and being able to make the decisions regarding them and where they are placed and who gets to use them and when and how, that's a very central factor of game cultural agency, I think. It mostly came, I think, up in relation to the childhood experiences, because those experiences included a lot of I didn't get to play, but my brother could play, or I had to fight my siblings over a turn to play games and so on. So it seemed to be very important for many that they were able to make those decisions by themselves and have the control and have the ownership. But also these relationships weren't limited to the use and control of the device, but I feel also to important game memories, for example, and having those special devices and special games that some had that followed them basically through their lives. Like they started playing a game in their childhood, completely fell in love with it, and then didn't necessarily even play any other games. They might have just returned to that over and over again. So I don't know if there's one way to answer this question, but I think it was there in many different forms. The relationship we have to game devices are very important for players and for the game cultural agency.
Fantastic. Let's sort of zoom out then a little bit and deal with context and regional distinctions affecting game cultures, because you do a large survey, and your survey data presents a few differences between Finnish and other regions that are presented. I think it's North American, broader European study, and the Finnish barometer, if I'm getting that correct. Yes. And one stat referenced something like 20% more folks play here, which is a lot. So can you sort of unpick that statistical difference for us with a bit of sort of history and infrastructural detail? Like, it's not just about it's dark in Finland, so we play more games. So what's happening?
Yeah. It's that as well, I think. No, to be honest, it gets quite dark and lonely in the wintertime. Yeah. Finland has a long tradition of LAN events, for example, networked gaming events, if someone is not familiar with the term. We've had events like Assembly, which started as a demo scene event, but quickly became a gaming event as well for a long time. And there's a strong tradition of, I feel like, organization of game hobbyists, maybe, in different areas. This can also be seen in how many esports organizations we also have in Finland, for example. And this kind of let's do it ourselves, I would say, attitude. Like, we are interested in this, let's get together, let's start an organization, let's start these events. Some of them, for example, the Insomnia event I visited for this study a couple of times, they had started as a local school event in the gym of the school for like 20 people or something. And then they have hundreds and hundreds of players now every year gathering together in these massive halls. But it's complete, like, it's not it's not for profit, because they also have some sponsors and so on. So there's this capitalistic side involved as well. But there's a great ethos of doing things together, getting like-minded people together, organizing these good events and experiences in the middle of those dark winters and other times. So I think that's a lot about that. Also, gaming is quite institutionalized in Finland in many ways. We get state funding, for example, for different types of organizations, but also funding for artists working on games, and of course researchers working on games. And we're the first country in the world to have the Esports Federation as the official member of the Olympic Committee, for example. So things like these show that there is a very strong gaming scene, gaming hobbyist scene, not only in gaming, but also in event production, in game jams, game development, in all of these areas. So I think that does affect the results that we received from this study.
Yeah, that's fantastic here. And it's, it's so important to have that history, because we so often hear about what happened in South Korea, and everyone knows what happened in South Korea, but we don't know what happens in other regions and how that growth has happened. So really appreciate that you've got that down. You did segue into a question for me, which is lovely. Are there then stakes involved for women not taking on or actually openly rejecting that term gamer? Like that terminology you've just talked about, it provides some kind of mobility, right, in here in Finland. If gamer is propped up institutionally, what does that mean for women who reject the term gamer? Do they make, like, our taxpayer dollars is going into other people that are getting that experience?
Yeah, that is a great question. And well, we do have organizations like, for example, Female Gamers Finland. So it's not that everyone rejects the term. And of course, it's about making these decisions about where to fight your battles in a way. And I guess there's also pleasure in accepting that identity and taking on those structures in a way and showing that, yes, I can and I do belong, and then maybe after that reject it at some point, possibly. That's not mandatory. But for sure, I think it is indeed that if you want to get involved in those arenas, if you want to occupy those spaces, if you want to have your presence there, then you need to somewhat play by the rules.
Great. This sort of extends into, you've already brought up the IESF, the International Esports Federation, and creating these different kinds of spaces for different kinds of participants, or so they would think. So can you maybe discuss the ISF tournament from your observations a little bit more, and how you make sense of the movement surrounding those gender segregated spaces? So even if you've just talked about that there's a sort of a women's association. So what's going on around these gender segregated spaces, and especially if you can have a look at esports, because, you know, gaming is popular here. Esports has a long tradition in Finland. But so what's happening with these gender segregated spaces?
Yeah, that is a huge question, and one that I'm constantly thinking about. So I have to say right away that I do not have a single clear answer, because it's obviously a very complicated matter. Because in the world of our dreams, we would all be participated on the same platforms together, competing fairly. There would be this ideal meritocracy instead of what we currently have. So I think the biggest problem with that particular situation, it was in 2014, was that in the competition they tried to exclude women from certain games completely. Hearthstone, I think, was one of them at least. So it was like, okay, you have your own tournaments, but these are the games that you are not able to participate in because you are a woman. And that's obviously not promoting women gamers. And also I've always found the justification of explaining, but okay, but this is like sport, so that's because that's why it's okay, and that's why we should do it, because then it's like more serious and more legitimate form of electronic sports and whatever. But yeah, it's a complicated issue. I have found, from my understanding, at least based on, okay, I asked the women who participated in the study who were following esports, or well, I asked everyone, but quite a few of them were following esports. Over 50% had followed at some point. And then I asked that, okay, but why are you participating? And if you're not participating, then why aren't you? And the women described so many, so awful things that were preventing them from taking part. One of the questionnaire respondents said that, okay, being a woman in esports is like pouring gasoline to the fire, like explosion. It's like, it's just impossible situation to be in. It's impossible it's a impossible field to participate in as a woman. So for me, the message that these spaces, esports spaces, are not safe for women at the moment was extremely strong. So then we have two options. Either we try to make them completely safe right away and reach that ideal world immediately, but somehow that I don't unfortunately think that is realistic. So at the moment I feel like the more focus should be put on creating these safe environments and lifting up the women who want to participate and offering them the resources and support needed and paying special attention that they can reach that initial threshold and cross that to get involved. And then maybe we can take those one step at a time towards that ideal world.
Yeah, great. Because I was going to ask, because you're going to get asked this eventually. Someone's going to come and say, Usva, help us. What do we do? You've studied this. I mean, you're in the paper. They're going to call you. And you're going to need to have some kind of answer. Like, what is the intervention strategy? Like, what is the first step? But it sounds like you've already been thinking about those first steps. My concern is that it does sound through your interviewees that ship has sailed for them. And you are also talking about really high investment folks that really do engage in that space called, high intensity play, or have that high game playing capital. But they seem to be have given up on that. So have we lost a sort of a generation of representatives who would normally have moved into that space because of the harshness of what you've documented?
Yeah, I believe that may very well be the case, unfortunately. And in general, it was really alarming to me that not only esports, but gaming in general, especially online team play, which is usually competitive games, so it's also related to esports in a way, that the women described that I do not participate in those kinds of games at all, even though they would love gaming. They might be interested, but they felt that certain types of games and gaming environments just aren't safe for women. One description, in addition to the like pouring gasoline to fire quote, another described that she didn't want to participate in online games because of the wave of filth that would wash over her because of her gender if she would. So it's not only an issue in esports, but it's much more wider game cultural issue, and steps have to be taken not only in esports but in gaming in general. And I think those have a great effect on each other potentially.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you already addressed that in your dissertation really well, I think. You actually pulled together a really good literature review about overviews and strategies, particularly from North American studies, North American women in games, and how, the techniques that they use to avoid harassment. I'm wondering, was there any distinction that you saw in the other kinds of techniques from this Finnish located study? Is there something like locally identifiable techniques of resistance, so to speak?
Not really. I think the techniques described to avoid and shield yourself from discrimination in those environments were quite similar to what we've seen in previous studies, which is not participating and not joining the voice chat so that people don't hear your voice and recognize you as a woman, using a gender neutral game tag so that people don't think you're a woman when they see you in the game, and so on. Those were quite similar. But one difference that might be a difference, but I don't really have the data to back this up based on this study alone, but I got this sense that what surprised me was that the women in my study were quite actively participating in gaming events. And then from some studies from North American context, from gaming events, but also similar like geek culture events, Comic Cons and so on, I've seen that women have described those spaces very unsafe, and that wasn't brought up at all in my material, although I did not ask about that specifically, so it may also be because of that. But maybe, hopefully, one thing that we might think here is that there are some things that are better here, not in the online environment, because that is of course internationally shared as well, but maybe in these local environments.
There was an extra thing that you've mentioned in your dissertation that sort of piqued my ears, because I think it was really interesting to hear you just say, though, that not having that LAN experience or that con experience of being hostile, because we hear that from other Nordic countries, that that's also the case, that those physical spaces are quite diverse and quite inclusive, and also have inclusive stands. So that's really interesting to hear, is that difference. But you do mention later on in your interviewees or in your survey qualitative notes that a lot of your participants made actually better connections with men. And we've heard that talked about, like Jenny Sunden's great ethnography, and WOW talks about, all of these different connections we have, but not this specific connection of actually that was a direct outcome that one of your participants, I think, started talking about. Actually, that's kind of like a technique shift in a way as well. There's something in that participant identifying that. Can you speak more on those relationships?
Yes, well, that was indeed very interesting. This participant in particular described that before she started a gaming hobby, she hadn't really connected with men or boys, never had friends who are boys or men before. But then she joined a gaming club because she was interested in gaming. and then there found out that, okay, so we get along and this is great time, and then she had started making friends with men as well. And this was a very positive experience for her, and also she was one of the respondents or interviewees actually who felt that her gender had a positive effect in her gaming, because she also enjoyed that special attention she received as the only woman participating in that gaming club. I'm not sure, I don't think that kind of experience was very usual in this material, but it was indeed an interesting point that gaming can also open those pathways into certain types of environments and social contexts for women that they would not necessarily otherwise have access to.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear about. Throughout your dissertation, you talk about the macro movements, the cultural institutions, and you talk about the micro, right, the personal, the meaningful stuff for me. What stuff's happening in the middle, right, the meso-level stuff? So this is a study from 2014 to about 2018. You've got a nice slice of time here. Is there anything that was really sort of significant beyond the personal and institutional at that time that you sort of saw percolating, like motion in the system that was happening between diverse actors that perhaps now in 2022, we're all bright and shiny now, has led to changes in women's game cultural participation?
There are quite huge things that have happened during this time. Like, of course, initially there was the shock that I started doing this study actively in 2014, and that's in the first autumn when I think that was when I had my first funding. Gamergate happened. So that was that was the cultural context in which I started doing this research, and like, spoken frankly, it freaked me out. And I even, in some ways, I had to even consider my own safety as a young, just starting researcher working on this topic in the middle of this extremely hostile, huge, violent cultural movement targeted against women who are somehow involved in gaming. Also, I think esports has grown hugely in this time, and some big movements happened there as well, just as I was starting, because on that first summer of working on this research, I participated in the assembly, the big gaming event in Helsinki, and they had esports tournaments there, and that was the first time esports was broadcasted from the event to the national TV in Finland. So there are so huge things that are happened, and not only in different spheres of game culture, but also in the study of this topic. Like, there wasn't that much. Of course, there was literature, and there was good and important literature when I started, but not like we have today. And keeping up with these changes has been, of course, extremely challenging in so many ways, as this has taken a while. And also, but to actually answer your question, I think what we see now in all these different areas, because of these huge events, even the negative ones, because of more research has come out in this area, is that people are talking more about these topics, and not only in research, but in game media, in game communities. Gaming events are taking steps to make sure those environments are safe for diverse participants and so on. So I think there has been many different changes related to this topic, and I've seen them, and I'm just trying to trying to catch up with them, I guess, while finalizing this work.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep, those structures are changing in those places exactly that you're saying. Small steps, but still moving. Because you brought up methods, we'll jump back to methods. And talking about your own safety, a really great topic to be talking about in this space. I'm really happy to hear you saying that you took your own health and well-being in this journey seriously as well. So let's discuss core methods used in this thesis and why you used this particular approach to understand this particular research topic.
Yes, there were some surprises and changes in that as well, because, well, initially, of course, when you first start a doctoral dissertation study project, I think I'm not the only one who wants to kind of involve everything in the field in that project. So that was my starting point, unfortunately. And what this dissertation came out to be is very different from my initial work plan for it. And where I started from was I wanted to do the interviews, and then I was originally intending to do some ethnographic work in gaming events, which I visited a few. I made some observations, but nothing systematic, so that didn't end up in that form in this final work. But yeah, I started with the interviews. I did those in the gaming events I first participated in, and then collected more. And then I thought that, okay, so maybe I will also gather some additional material with online questionnaire to get some more get a bit more of these responses, maybe from a bit wider perspective, and so on and so on. And then when I received the 737 responses, that was not something that I had expected at all. And to be honest, then I was in trouble, because I've been trained as a very qualitative researcher, and then I was thinking okay, how do I get through this mountain of material and all these questions, and how do I combine these? And I did find some kind of a solution, because you can see the end results here, but it was a big challenge for me. So to answer the question, I did not, if I'm completely honest, make the plan like this as it turned out. I'm gonna choose these methods, I'm gonna get this amount of material, because I had no way to predict that originally. But it was also a very positive, although shocking, turn of events, that I was just overwhelmed by the number of women who wanted to participate and who wanted to talk to me about their gaming. And also I share the online questionnaire link only on Facebook. I was intending to spread it on many channels, but then I noticed the number of incoming responses and didn't. But after I had shared it on Facebook, I noticed many different organizations sharing it. It wasn't just me, but also things like gaming tech stores and some gaming education organizations and places like that. So I was surprised. I was a bit overwhelmed, but it was a great learning process, and I think I managed to get a decent reading on this material, but also I'm really happy that I will be able to work on it further after this.
Yeah, that's just it's a fantastic response. It really reminds us of old confessionals in ethnography, where you confess, you do a little section that confesses what went wrong and it hurt so much. And that's important. The research process is imperfect, and we learn on the journey. I was very curious when I was first reading this with the survey and your choice to conduct surveys, which, because of your position here, because it might be argued a survey is a bit of a distancing of body and involvement with other women's practices, which would be a distinction from your feminist standpoint on methodology and situated knowledge. But at the same time, through your confessional and just the way you've managed to pull together the narrative, all and all of the different methods, I think you've managed to bring your methods and data and position actually really well together. They're quite cohesive. So it all makes sense now. It's not just here are some numbers, that's it. And expertise has been developed in the process, which is, of course, the most important of the journey. But I just want to stick with that a bit as well, because I think you do a bit of a defensive maneuver on the surveys, like they're qualitative. And yes, they are. But there are 700 people that answered them. And you just said that. It's like so many people wanted to participate. So is there something strategic that you can do a little bit more around taking that data quantitatively? It's like that can do work too. Are you sort of leaving that bit out and not letting that research actually do that kind of numbers work that is still valued in certain parts of the industry, right?
Yeah, I'm not if it was I'm not sure if it was a strategic decision for me, but more like something that I was forced to do because I didn't have that training and I was not able to get. I didn't have the resources, the time needed to get that training to do it for this study. I think that in a way it is a shame. I'm happy to be a qualitative researcher. I'm happy with how I'm approaching the material and how I'm reading it. But I also see the point that you could also get a lot out of this with quantitative approaches. So just not strategic, just circumstantial, and maybe because I of course still have the material, so maybe I am able to do some kind of collaboration on that at a later point, because of course those approaches, qualitative, quantitative, both have their own uses and provide different types of valuable information.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's move on to what we know about existing literature and how you've built onto them. How do you think your findings develop the literature that we've already got in game studies on women who play intensely or extensively engaged in game cultures? And what would you say are distinctly your additions to knowledge on women's game cultural participation and agency?
There is a lot of, as I said in the Lectio, very important high quality work that has been produced on this topic in the recent years. And in this dissertation I have tried to bring some of those central perspectives from the related to the topic of this study together and build up on that by examining how those central themes that I identified in the earlier literature were present in this material and in these women's experiences. I think maybe it's a confession time again. It's one of the areas of this research process that I could have done maybe a bit better, and that I also still have a lot to learn in, is that I could have also taken a more focused and critical stance on the existing work and see what are the things that that maybe are different in this material and maybe even contradict how this material maybe even contradicts the earlier work, and widen those perspectives. But I think what I managed to do here and what was my main focus here as well was that I tried to bring together, I tried to identify the central perspectives that have been brought up in the earlier research and then bring those together to a synthesis and then explore how those themes are present in the participants' lives.
I personally appreciate the building on and collaborating and not antagonistic and foil making of others. So I appreciate that you've taken that approach in any case. But you do use concepts and you engage with work that's been around for a while. So can you maybe, and for the public here as well, can you talk us through the distinction between someone like Mia Consalvo's, massive term that you use throughout this work around game capital, and to your extended, like your pushed out version of that term on game cultural capital? And importantly, why that's a required shift and focus? Why a new term? Why a new boundary? How does that concept shift us for game studies a little bit?
Yes, thank you. I need to find the specific section of the work to make sure I don't contradict with myself, because that might happen. Yes, so I have this tricky version that I need to. Yes. So Mia Consalvo's, of course, very important work in the field of game studies in general. Cheating the game out, 2007, yes. And in that, she was, I'm sure if the first, but at least one of the most well-known examples of utilizing Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital within the context of game culture. And she discusses it as gaming capital. I hope I'm not misinterpreting Consalvo's work, but from my reading of it, I attach the concept in her work more to the actual skill and action of playing games. And in here and in my reading, I wish to understand it as game cultural capital, not just gaming skill capital, but more widely as a wider game cultural agency, expertise, engagement, and everything related to that.
Perfect. And do we need a term?
I feel that we do. Yes, I feel that we do. I think it's important to understand that, well, maybe to quickly explain to the audience my theoretical starting point here. So I'm using Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital and understanding it as game cultural capital. So cultural capital that is collected, acquired in the context of game culture. And I find that the game cultural capital is what defines a person's position in this field, and their status, and how highly they are regarded, and how strongly they are regarded as a gamer.
Yeah, great. And because Consalvo builds on Bourdieu, does Bourdieu give you, like that going, the one foundation down or the one level down, does Bourdieu give you enough wiggle room for the networked context of play and performances and co-present work that a lot of these women are doing? And I think automatically of esports, when you're on stage, online, in the room, in your own head, like you're co-present in so many ways and performing. So I'm wondering, do you sort of run into any challenges? Did you run into any challenges when you're thinking with capital in co-present, networked, always here, always there kind of spaces of performance?
Well, I think that's when the habitus comes in. So like Bourdieu presents the concept of habitus as the embodied dispositions of this cultural capital, like how we, with our bodies, communicate our cultural capital by the way we, for example, discuss certain things or react to certain things, for example. And I think that's the gamer habitus, as I call it in this work, is very well adaptable to those different circumstances and aligning spaces and environments that we are positioned in different ways when we are participating in game culture.
Great. So let's stick with gamer habitus a little bit more. And you identify what is an absolutely brutal cycle. So I'm really happy you've put this down on paper like a little model for us out of gamer habitus that works to sort of cyclically undermine women's presence in games, and especially in competitive games, especially in team competitive games online, and at every step of the action. And it goes something like this. This is you describing it. You play well, your teammates yell at the other team, you got beaten by a girl. You play poorly, you're representative of all women. You identify as a woman visibly in chat or by using voice chat, you run the risk of stereotype threat, and then that goes back to the start again. So it can read as a little defeatist because it's a cycle made for the consistent othering and marginalisation of women in games. My question is, how have you perhaps identified any new shifts being made to that gamer habitus upheld cycle in those distinct spaces? And you also talk about very distinct spaces, so I know this is a tough question because it's different everywhere.
Yeah, like, maybe I want to say that unfortunately not. Like, it's just that bad. In my eyes, it's an, I would say, impossible existence as a woman in those spaces, because you're almost, but it's also like how Stuart Hall describes cultural identity, that it's always almost there, but not quite. You're always the other, especially as a woman. As a woman, you do not reach the gamer habitus because of your embodied gender performance that is always present.
Yeah, that is disappointing to hear. Mostly that the intervention is not there. That excellent explanation as well. I'm going to be a little greedy here and ask about something that I personally really want to know about, and it's about the state of women in sports games. Your findings look similar to other studies in terms of this really low percentage of women playing sports games, around, I think, 3% you noted. Are you starting to think about the stakes involved for these sort of genre-specific moments of where women play or where women don't play? And I'm thinking especially in sports games and the issues surrounding women's cultural agency in those spaces, not just now but moving forward. We know that the Olympics are looking to have sports games now as their sort of primary e-sport, or rather e-game alternative. So we're seeing sports game move really quickly into other kinds of spaces. I'm wondering what you're starting to think about these sort of genre-specific challenges where women are not.
Yes, here I have to make maybe another confession about my own position as a researcher here, which is also something that has obviously affected greatly on how I have interacted with the participants and how I have read this material. And of course, like, one of the things about this work is that it's very strongly focused on that very core game culture, and maybe those sports games are not that in. Of course, there's a big, huge hobbyist scene and even competitive scene for games like NHL, FIFA, so on, but those are maybe not at the very core of esports, which is also why it's very disappointing for esports people to hear that, okay, but this is what we want you to play here in the Olympics, because to the people in that scene that doesn't make any sense. So it was not surprising to me, and in general I felt that the women participating in the study were very strongly, in some ways, positioned there in the very core of the hegemonic digital game culture. So it's not surprising that they were playing like action, adventure, strategy, shooter games, and not as much sports.
Yeah, great. So let's stick with that around sort of those identity distinctions in forms of, that really localized platform-specific hegemonic masculinity of the right way to play, right? Your participants were clearly encountering this. You've got all of these little notes and descriptions from different spaces of play about belonging in games. Are there some distinctions to practice that you can highlight that stand out for you? And I am really interested in thinking about this particular little context, because as you've already told us, Overwatch is completely different to Counter-Strike or to a sports games. So what are those distinctions that really have stood out in your participants when you're asking them about dealing with that sort of dominant gamery hegemonic masculinity in a space? Is it local server cultures? Is it game numbers? Is it small teams, big teams, genre of play, or the time of play distinctions? What do we really need to be thinking about? What's happening in those specific spaces of play?
In terms of, can you please
repeat? In terms of that experience, that dominance of a really, let's go with a hard-felt form of the dominant way to play games, somehow is loosened up in different kinds of places. And you mentioned this yourself, why WoW matters, right? World of Warcraft is still a space where we see a less antagonistic, a less competitive, or there are spaces that are less about that than, for example, when Overwatch didn't have, different distinctions of roles you had to take. So are there sort of platform and specifics that change how we experience the dominant form of the right way to play?
For sure. And that's also a part, also to mention that the game cultural capital it's a general term, but it's also specific to certain games. In this game, you possess greater amount of game cultural capital if you are able to play it this way, follow the meta, have certain competitive ranking, for example, and so on. I'm not sure if I can think of any specific games that would come to mind from this perspective, but I think it was maybe more generally about certain genres and play styles. As I mentioned before, especially in competitive online team-based games, those were something that some women simply didn't play, and they felt excluded entirely. But there were some interesting examples from the women who did play them, and what kind of negotiation they had to go through to be able to be present and participate in those games. And how their presence was interpreted through these different, maybe gender expectations, but also stereotypes. For example, there was one interviewee who played a MOBA game competitively even, and she said that when she had joined a new team, the expectations set for her were different than for her teammates, but not only in terms of, okay, so you can maybe play a bit easier classes or take this a bit easier role, but also in terms of behavior and being there in those team settings and those gaming sessions in specific ways. For example, she mentioned that whenever she asked a question about something that was called that they were doing, it was read or interpreted by her team as complaining, even though it was just, want to know more. So I think that is a great question. I think I cannot really fully answer to it in a very deep sense, because I cannot think of very clear examples right now based on this study, but I'm sure that is something that can and should be definitely explored more.
Yeah, fantastic. Looking at your final chapter here and the features of player, gamer, and hobbyist, how can sort of the everyday citizen here understand why these identifications are important for understanding Finnish game-oriented cultural life?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me find that. Just a moment. I will browse through my list of tables, so I can also find that as a note for myself. 162. Yes, so I asked the participants both in the online questionnaire and the interviews about different, I might call them gamer terms, like a player, a gamer, and then a game hobbyist, and then also a casual gamer and a hardcore gamer. And I asked them to define what kind of a person is a gamer, what kind of a person is a player, and also to say if they would see or they would consider themselves as one. And this was kind of maybe an experiment from my part. Like, I had this initial thought that there might be some distinctions between these different types of gaming, gamer identities maybe, or ways of gaming. And then I wanted to hear what the women participating in the study, if they felt the same, or if they how would they consider any of those identities or terms. And it was really interesting that there were such clear distinctions in the descriptions. Of course, that is in part because I asked about them. So they, like, I'm not sure if they had initial ideas of, okay, player is certainly different from a gamer and so on. But when I asked them to make those distinctions, they were certainly able to. And those were very interesting. There was something that I could predict beforehand, some results. For example, that a gamer was described in a very similar way to hardcore gamer. But there were also some interesting similarities between the different terms that I might not have expected.
And are hardcore and professional really cut of the same cloth? You know, are they because they're aligned very closely, but they seem to have quite different also gender distinctions about who gets to live within them.
Yeah, I think now I need to think about if I remember this correctly, but I think professional gameplay was mentioned. Yes, it was mentioned in relation to each. That's not maybe how I would personally initially think about it, but it was definitely seen as, both of them, gamer and hardcore gamer, were seen as someone who plays a lot and with goal-oriented manner, and maybe even professionally. So it may be that people were thinking about esports players, for example.
So cosplaying and the professionalism that comes under those other forms that you talk about wasn't really considered by the participants. Great. So let's stick with sort of what you're talking about in here about moving beyond that gamer identity. When and where is this post-gamer era? Resistance to dominant structures and practices in game cultures has been ongoing. So why and perhaps how does the post-gamer identity moment matter for us really, really now in both the academy but also for the public in this room?
To me, it was, first of all, very surprising, like as I mentioned in the lectio, that I was completely expecting the women to want to be gamers. So this is not an argument that I initially made, but something that I learned during the process. So maybe it's a bit difficult for me to define why now and why here, because it was in a way so surprising to me. But on the other hand, it makes sense, especially because I started the study after Gamergate, when it had already been discussed in public that time of gamers is over, and there had been research on focusing on, for example, Adrian Shaw's work on arguing that we shouldn't try to fit everyone in under the gamer term, but instead try to critically deconstruct the idea and examining it. But still, of course, it's still prevalent. Like I'm not arguing that there are no people who identify as gamers, and there is certainly those cultural structures that uphold the idea and ideal of what a gamer is and who a gamer is, that is highly valued within the game culture. But still, from these women's responses, from how they reacted to it when asked to consider their own relationship to the term, and considering how active participants in game culture they were, I feel that based on that there is definitely a shift there.
Yeah. Wonderful. I'd really like to hear about the finding, or maybe an expression from practice that haunts you the most. Like, what haunts you about this exploration? And I've got one that is haunting me, and that's that sports, not playing sports games. That is haunting me already. So what is yours?
That is such an excellent question. And well, the obvious answer would be that the women did not want to define themselves as gamers, because that was what I was like ready to argue, that here I can show you women are gamers. So maybe in a way, maybe, yeah, I know it's a bit of a boring answer and self-obvious, but it really was a big deal for me also as a researcher to understand, like, of course I have, in a way I had that understanding that how I as a woman, as a gamer, experience these things and understand these things isn't necessarily reflected on these women's experiences. But to have such a huge contradiction between what I initially thought and then what I was able to read from there, and learn so much from that process. Well, you asked about haunting. It's not a negative experience, but still it's something that greatly affected me as a researcher as well.
Yeah, that's great to know. Is there a part of your dissertation that you're also burning to talk about for the audience that I haven't mentioned? I've just got to ask, is there something like everyone needs to know this? I'm going to tell you about that right now.
I think we may have covered
them. You sure? Are you sure? All right, then we'll move on to the last question for today. And I really wanted to leave on this one, and you've absolutely discussed it, but I wanted to double down. The pride women take in their gaming leisure. Despite these gender-based distinctions to play, and actually the prevalence of abuse, which is also haunting. You speak about participants taking pride in their gaming leisure. So let's celebrate that for the last question here. Can you maybe talk us through some of those bigger ticket, those high-level points around how women's identity as a player of digital games or a participant in making game cultures, not necessarily hands on the machine, and talk about some of that pride they take in the experience of participation?
Yes, I think that was a great and very important thing to be able to read, especially in the middle of those experiences, from the hate, from the harassment, the feeling of not belonging, that people shared their joy, their positive experiences, and their pride on being members of game culture. And some, like, as I said, it's not that all the participants of the study rejected the gamer identity. For some, it was important part of their own identity, and some were specifically proud to call themselves women gamers. But on the other hand, on a bit of a negative side, it was, I felt, often portrayed against the backdrop of all the hostility. That in this way of, okay, everyone thinks that I suck, everyone thinks that I shouldn't be here, but I am here, I can show my skills, and I can prove them wrong. And there was pride in that for some, showing that they are not the stereotype, in even more negative way, even showing that they're not like the other women. There's also that aspect of that as well. But in a truly positive and something that reading that those descriptions made me happy when I was reading the material was how the women described the meaning of gaming in their lives. Because there were so many different ways that gaming was part of their lives and helped them through many things and gave them so much joy and meaning that it was just incredible. The women describe, for example, that gaming helped them through very rough times in their lives, through some mental health issues such as depression. It allowed them to form very significant social relationships, and it was just so enjoyable and meaningful activity to them in so many ways that most of them, when I asked about what does gaming means to you, so many of them said that it's something that I see as a part of my life in some form, in some way, forever. Like it was such an important thing for them. So that was something that I found very significant.
Thank you. All right. So thank you so much, Usva. And thank you to everyone here today in the audience, especially members from the Centre for Excellence in Game Culture Studies from the University of Turku, from schools from Tampere and Jyväskylä. So this manuscript has addressed, and I quote, what role gender plays in game cultural participation and what kinds of gender performances are involved for women who choose to participate, quoting from Usva Friman, page 25. For those outside of game studies research, the gender-specific issues affecting women's cultural agency are clearly significant. It reflects on who we are okay with being and what we're okay with seeing or enduring in everyday play cultures. It informs national, public and private institutions on how equity structures already in place do or do not work for participation in the play and leisure of our time. And as basic research, it documents a significant time and social setting of Finnish leisure life. I'm satisfied with Usva's presentation and deliberation of her work on gender and cultural participation. She's connected to and made very important distinctions from existing scholarship relevant to her research and has defended her qualitative contribution to game studies. Usva's study and time working on this topic has also contributed elsewhere. While academics and their scholarship are often called out as working from the ivory tower, which suggests isolation in one's field and niche area of research, academic research and scholarly production is in essence a collaborative effort. This research presented today, drawing on feminist standpoints of knowledge production, cultural studies and sociological thinkers, is a cooperative piece. This is not to take away from Usva's producing efforts in research here, but rather to celebrate that Usva has achieved a manuscript that honours collaboration with your supervisors, with your colleagues, with your academic peers globally who work on gender, games and esports. Also, or perhaps here most of all, the final manuscript has given space for the participants who contributed to your study and allowed them to breathe. You gave them room on the page for us to read their experiences in their own words and through their detailed interests en masse. And as another qualitative researcher, I truly appreciate this balance you've struck across participant voice, analysis and existing scholarly engagement, as well as when the numbers matter here. The presented survey work extends existing nationally based reports on gaming and digital leisure practices, while posing an alternative document to regional industry and marketing perspectives and other methodologically under-problematized figures on women in games. You've done an excellent job in making your research materials speak to different types of publics and publications. You've documented and centered voices and experiences that are important to understand how participation in games is done, which is essential basic research, but which also can inform the future of participatory frameworks. And I hope and I encourage that this work is extended beyond the Academy as a public sociology on game cultural participation, particularly for the state of play of women emerging into the practices of organised high-performance games and esports. What is significant for me in reading this material is its holistic presentation, but also that it's localised to women from a high gender equity landscape who are highly invested in this leisure form. In this, we receive a nuanced look at participation from somewhere, where contexts of game leisure, which we as readers can engage with a little more fully. The discussion today emphasises the need for ongoing study in the area, and Usva, you've also pushed your research further here, arguing for scholars to consider how and who they recognise as high-intensity game cultural participants. You've presented the idea of game cultural participation as an inclusive framework to study games, which makes a strong argument to game studies scholars, encouraging them to reflect on their existing knowledge contributions and their emerging research designs and whose work they acknowledge. The sign of a compelling dissertation for me is leaving with questions and points you want to hear more about because you connect with them. You're left eager for a round two. And this is not because there are underdeveloped topics, but rather the ideas presented intersect with other spaces and other fields, which is another sign of excellent qualitative research. That is, it's expansive in its presentation to the extent that others can lean into it and build from it from elsewhere. You have a lifetime of future studies already lined up in these pages. Congratulations and well done on your work thus far and your presentation today.
Thank you. I now respectfully invite any members of the honoured audience who wish to offer a criticism of my dissertation to request the Custos for permission to speak.
If no members of the honoured audience wish to present any comments on the dissertation, this public defense of the doctoral dissertation is now concluded.